The first whistle of the eastbound train was still miles away when Jonas McGraw stepped onto the station platform, his boots crunching against boards damp with morning dew, and there at the edge of the steps sat a little girl no taller than his saddle horn, her hair tangled, her dress torn at the hem, her bare feet smudged with dust, and in her thin arms she cradled a rag doll so worn its seams gaped like wounds. She looked up at him with eyes that were far too old for 9 years and whispered, "If I had money, would you stay?" The words struck him harder than any outlaw's bullet, raw and small, yet echoing across the quiet platform until even the station master inside stilled his pen. Listening. Jonas froze, his hand still on the rail, the brim of his hat shadowing his weathered face, his chest tightening in a way he had not felt in years. Around them, early travelers stirred, farmers waiting on supply wagons, women with parcels, a ranch hand chewing tobacco, and their whispers rose sharp and quick. "She's Mayfield's girl," someone muttered. "Father gone, mother buried last winter." "She's always hanging round here, waiting for someone to take her." Another voice, crueler, laughed. "She thinks a cowboy can be bought." Jonas's jaw clenched, his eyes shifting to the bundle she held tighter than breath itself, that ragged doll with one button eye still clinging on. He knelt without meaning to, his spurs scraping the wood, and the girl's face lit with a fragile hope as she pushed the doll forward as though it were a purse of coins. "I don't got real money," she whispered, "but I can give you her. She's all I've got. If you'd stay." Jonas felt the heat rise in his throat, memories long buried clawing back, of his own boyhood on a station much like this, of waiting for a hand that never came. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time in years saw himself, small and desperate, begging in silence. The station master, Mr. Pike, stepped out then, his gray mustache bristling with impatience, his voice brisk as he called, "Clara Mayfield, you best get ready. Girl, the train'll carry you east where you belong, and no amount of begging will change that." The child flinched, clutching the doll against her chest, but her gaze stayed locked on Jonas, pleading. "If I had money," she repeated, her voice trembling yet stubborn, "would you stay?" And in that moment, with dawn spilling pale light across the town and a hush gathering on the platform, every soul present turned to see what answer the cowboy would give, though Jonas himself felt the weight of the question heavier than any law, heavier than any chain he had ever borne, and knew that whatever words left his mouth would bind more than just himself. The silence that clung to the platform shattered when Station Master Pike rapped the doorframe with his ledger, his sharp voice cutting through the morning air like a whip. "Clara Mayfield, enough of this foolishness. When the train whistles, you'll be on it, bound east to the orphanage where law and order still mean something. No cowboy, no drifter, no soft-hearted passerby will interfere." His words rang heavy, and the crowd shifted, some nodding in weary agreement while others looked away, ashamed to witness the small girl's humiliation. Clara hugged her rag doll tight, the fabric nearly dissolving beneath her trembling fingers. And her chin lifted with a stubbornness that cracked through her tears. "I don't belong to an orphanage," she cried, her voice shrill with grief. "I belong with someone who'll stay." Her gaze fixed again on Jonas, as if the entire town had melted away, and only his answer could save her. Jonas felt every whisper burn against his skin. A farmer muttered, "Best let Pike send her. She'll be clothed and fed." A woman hushed her own child and whispered, "Poor thing's begging for a stranger's hand." And still the words Clara had spoken echoed in Jonas's chest. "If I had money, would you stay?" He shifted, the spurs on his boots biting against the boards. Torn between stepping back into silence or forward into a storm, he wasn't sure he had the strength to weather. Pike narrowed his eyes, sensing hesitation, and barked, "McGraw, I know your kind. You've no land, no kin, nothing but dust trailing behind you. Don't let pity trick you into meddling. This girl is the town's responsibility, and the law says she goes east." He turned back inside as if the matter were settled, but the hush that fell was heavy with doubt. For every face now studied Jonas, weighing whether the quiet cowboy would turn his back or take the step no one else dared. Clara clutched the doll to her heart, rocking slightly on the station step, her lips moving without sound. A prayer, perhaps, or the unfinished echo of her question, and Jonas realized with a jolt that the entire town was waiting not for Pike's decree, but for his reply. The train whistle sounded faint and far, a low moan on the horizon, and as it curled through the morning air, Clara's panic sharpened into something fierce, her small frame shaking but her voice carrying clear across the platform. "If money's what keeps folks, then take her," she cried, thrusting her rag doll forward with both hands, the cloth limp, the button eye barely hanging on, yet offered with a dignity that made the crowd stir. "She's all I have, and she's worth more than pennies, 'cause she's been my mama when I was lonely." The words struck like a hammer, some women covering their mouths as tears welled, while a group of young ranch hands in the corner burst into cruel laughter. One jeering, "Best trade she'll ever make! Cowboy for a rag!" Jonas felt the sound slice into him, his fists clenching, his chest burning with shame not for Clara, but for the men who mocked her. He knelt again, though his mind screamed at him to walk away, and when his calloused hand brushed the doll, he felt the fragile seams like scars pressed into his own skin. Pike stepped back onto the platform then, his boots loud, his ledger tucked under his arm. "That doll's no coin," he said sharply, "and no man here can be bought with scraps. Girl, enough of this. When the train pulls in, you board, and this begging ends." Clara jerked the doll back against her chest, her eyes blazing through tears. "Then I'll scream till the whole town hears me," she shouted, "and they'll know I tried to pay for someone to stay." The crowd erupted, half shocked, half murmuring, and Jonas felt every gaze slide toward him, weighing his silence as betrayal. The rag doll trembled in Clara's arms, the symbol of everything she had lost and everything she still hoped to keep. And Jonas knew the train was drawing closer, the choice barreling down on him like iron wheels on a track. And no law, no decree, no mockery from the crowd could delay it much longer. The rumble of the approaching train grew louder, the rails humming beneath the wooden planks, and with every heartbeat Jonas felt the pressure mount, until it seemed the whole station leaned toward him, waiting for a word he had not yet found the courage to give. Clara clutched the rag doll to her chest, her small body trembling but her eyes fixed on him with a stubborn light, as if the fate of the world depended on whether he would stay or turn away. Station Master Pike seized the silence like a weapon, stepping forward with his ledger raised like a gavel, his voice sharp and merciless. "You hear that, McGraw? That's the eastbound coming, and with it the law's will. This girl boards, and she'll be clothed, fed, and worked proper. If you interfere, you'll answer to me and to every man who keeps order in this town." He turned to the crowd, sweeping his arm as though to pull them onto his side. "Do we want beggars cluttering our streets? Do we want lawbreakers meddling in God's order? Or do we want this town strong and clean?" Murmurs rippled through the gathering, a split forming in their faces. Some nodding grimly, muttering that orphans were better off east, others whispering that the girl's plea was too raw to ignore. Jonas's silence fed the storm, his jaw tight, his eyes on the ground as memories surged, his own childhood waiting on a platform. The promise of a father who never returned, the bitter taste of abandonment that had never left his tongue. He wanted to walk, to keep the wall he had built around himself, but Clara's small voice broke through, fragile yet fierce. "If I had real money, I'd pay you to be my pa," she whispered, her words quivering. "But I only got her, and I'll give her forever if it means you stay." She held the doll out again, tears streaking her dusty cheeks, and the crowd went still, every whisper snuffed by the sight of a child offering her last possession to buy love. Jonas's chest ached, his breath heavy, and though he had not yet spoken, the weight of his silence had become its own answer. And the platform strained under the question of whether he would finally break it before the train arrived. The shriek of the train's whistle tore through the air as the engine came into view, smoke billowing above the prairie horizon, and the crowd surged closer, their whispers rising like a restless tide. But Jonas remained rooted, every muscle taut, as if bound by chains from another life. Clara still held the rag doll toward him, her hands trembling, her lips quivering as she tried to keep her chin high. And in her eyes Jonas saw not just a child's desperation, but the reflection of his own boyhood, long buried yet alive in the ache of his chest. He drew a ragged breath, and before he knew it, the words left him, rough as gravel, but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "I once sat on a station step just like this," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs, "waiting for someone who never came back." The crowd stilled, faces turning as if a sudden wind had swept through. Pike's brows knitted, confusion flashing across his stern features, but Clara's eyes widened, hope sparking anew. Jonas pressed on, his voice thick. "I had a rag doll, too, my sister's. Carried it till it was nothing but threads, 'cause it was all I had to prove I'd been loved once. I know what it means to sit here begging for someone to stay, wondering if you're worth the trouble." His hand shook as he reached towards the doll in Clara's arms. But Pike slammed his ledger down on the railing, his voice sharp. "Don't you fill her head with false hope, McGraw. You're a drifter, a man with no land, no ties. You'll leave her just as you were left, and she'll suffer worse for it." Some in the crowd muttered agreement, but others shifted uneasily, shame stirring in their eyes. A woman near the back whispered, "Let the girl have him. Better him than the orphan train." Clara clung tighter to the doll, her gaze locked on Jonas, and her voice cracked as she pleaded, "Then don't leave me like you were left. Please, if I had money, would you stay?" The words struck him harder than the whistle's wail. And Jonas knew in that moment that silence was no longer his refuge, but his betrayal, and the choice that had haunted him for decades now stared back in the form of a trembling child with a rag doll and the courage to ask what he had never dared. The engine hissed as it slowed into the station, iron wheels grinding against the rails, and the crowd pressed tighter, the tension swelling like a storm about to break. Station Master Pike, his face red with fury, pointed a stiff finger at Jonas, his voice sharp enough to pierce the roar of steam. "You hear the man confess it himself. Abandoned, cast aside, rootless as tumbleweed. What place has such a drifter to claim a child? He'll vanish when the wind changes, and she'll be left worse than before." The words bit hard, and murmurs of agreement rippled among the ranchers, men shaking their heads, muttering about stability, about law and order, while mothers clutched their children tighter, torn between pity and fear. Sheriff Callum, drawn by the commotion, stepped onto the platform, his badge catching the morning light, and the crowd parted for him like wheat before a scythe. His voice carried steady but heavy. "Jonas, think on this. If you take that girl, it won't just be your burden. It'll be your life. No more drifting, no more silence on the trail. You'll answer to her cries, her hunger, her every need, and the town will judge you every day for it." Jonas's jaw tightened, his eyes burning as he glanced down at Clara, her small hands clutching the rag doll so tightly her knuckles whitened, her gaze locked on him with hope that refused to dim. Pike stepped closer. Seizing the moment, Sheriff speaks true. Let the train carry her east. She'll have a roof, food, and order. Better that than false promises from a cowboy with nothing to his name." The crowd hummed, half swayed, half ashamed. But Clara broke the silence, her voice quivering yet sharp as an arrow. "If he leaves me, I'll be ash inside," she said, lifting the doll high. "If he stays, I'll be someone's child again." The words caught like flame in dry grass, faces softening, murmurs shifting, the air thick with unease at Pike's cruelty. Jonas felt the weight of the doll more than the sheriff's warning, more than the station master's decree. And in his chest, the question he had carried all his life twisted into a single truth, that the choice was no longer about staying or leaving, but about whether he would let another child face the silence that had scarred him forever. Steam rolled over the platform in white clouds as the train hissed to a halt, the iron beast looming with its open doors like a hungry mouth waiting to swallow the child whole. Station Master Pike lifted his ledger high, his voice cracking like a hammer striking iron. "Now's the hour. Clara Mayfield will board, and this nonsense ends. Jonas McGraw, step aside, or you'll answer for obstructing the law." His command tore through the crowd, splitting them in two, half muttering that Pike was right, that order must be kept, while others shifted uneasily, whispering that a girl's heart should weigh more than a statute written in ink. Jonas stood frozen, torn between the fire in his chest and the chains of fear that still bound him. But Clara, trembling yet fierce, broke from his side and planted herself squarely at the edge of the steps, her small figure framed by the towering engine and the restless crowd. She raised her rag doll high above her head, her voice ringing out with a clarity that cut through steam and chatter alike. "If I had money, I'd buy him to stay, but I only have her, and I give her to prove I ain't worthless." The crowd gasped, some women pressing hands to their mouths, men shifting in shame, while a cruel laugh cracked from a ranch hand in the back. "She thinks love's for sale." Clara's eyes blazed as she shouted back, "Love ain't for sale, it's for keepin', and I'll scream till the train leaves if nobody listens." The words echoed across the platform, defiance in every syllable, and the rag doll shook in her tiny hands as if it carried the weight of the entire town's conscience. Jonas felt his breath catch, the memory of his own doll, threads and ashes now long gone, flaring in his mind, and he realized Clara was doing what he had never done, refusing to be silent in the face of abandonment. Pike snarled, his patience snapping. "Enough of this spectacle! Sheriff, seize her and put her on the train before this madness spreads." But the sheriff hesitated, his eyes flicking from Clara's trembling figure to Jonas's stricken face, and the murmurs of the crowd swelled louder, a tide tipping against Pike's authority, as if all awaited the cowboy's answer to the child who had laid her entire soul bare on the station steps. Jonas felt the weight of every gaze press down on him, the steam hissing around his boots like the breath of some great beast urging him toward a choice he could no longer outrun. And as Clara's small figure stood defiant against the looming train, Ragdoll raised like a banner, the memory of his own boyhood clawed through the walls he had built. He stepped forward, slow but steady, his spurs striking sparks on the boards, and the crowd hushed as if the earth itself had paused to listen. His voice, when it came, was rough and uneven, but it carried. "I never stayed anywhere because I feared if I did, I'd watch it all burn away like it did when I was a boy. I sat on steps just like these, doll in my arms, waiting for someone who never came, and I swore I'd never feel that again." He stopped before Clara, his weathered face lowering to her tear-streaked eyes, his hand trembling as he reached to touch the rag doll she clutched. "But she's braver than I ever was. She ain't silent. She's standing where I once sat, demanding not to be forgotten." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some nodding, others bowing their heads in shame, and even the sheriff's eyes softened. Pike, red with fury, barked, "Words don't change the law! You've no land, no wife, no place fit for a child!" Jonas straightened, his hand tightening on Clara's shoulder. "Maybe I got no land. Maybe I got no roof but the sky. But I got arms that can carry, hands that can work, and a heart that won't leave when she needs me most. If that ain't enough, then the law's worth less than the dirt under my boots." A cheer broke from a woman near the back, quickly joined by others, the tide of voices swelling, drowning Pike's protests in a roar of approval. Clara's lips quivered, tears spilling down her cheeks as she pressed the rag doll into Jonas's hands, whispering so only he heard, "Then you'll stay?" He swallowed hard, the promise heavy yet liberating, and though his voice cracked, it rang true. "I'll stay." The whistle screamed again, the engine belching steam as the conductor called for passengers, his voice lost in the roar of the crowd, now pressed tight around the platform. Pike, his face twisted with rage, shoved through them, his ledger discarded, his fists clenched, as if law itself could be delivered through brute force. "Sheriff," he barked, spittle flying, "do your duty, take the child and put her on that train before this madness spreads any further." Sheriff Callum stood firm, his jaw locked, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver, but his eyes steady on Jonas and Clara. "Law was made to serve the living, Pike," he said, his tone calm but iron hard. "And I won't drag a girl screaming onto a train when she's found someone who'll claim her." The crowd erupted, half in cheers, half in shouts, the platform shaking with the swell of voices, but Pike would not yield. With a roar, he lunged forward, his hand seizing Clara's thin arm, yanking so hard the rag doll nearly tumbled from her grasp. She cried out, the sound piercing like a blade through the din, and Jonas moved without thought, his fist catching Pike's wrist, his other arm sweeping Clara back against his chest, the doll pressed between them as if sealing a bond that no force could break. Pike staggered, his face purple with rage, and spat, "You'll pay for this, McGraw! You're no better than the dust you ride on!" But his words were drowned as the crowd surged forward, men and women alike, their voices a thunderous chorus. "Let her stay, let her stay." Pike's arm was pulled back by townsfolk, his authority stripped by the very people he thought he commanded. Jonas stood tall, Clara clinging to him, the rag doll crushed between them, and for the first time in years his voice rang out steady and unafraid. "She asked if I'd stay, and I will. No law, no train, no man can make me walk away again." The sheriff raised his hand, calling for quiet, and when the roar dimmed, he nodded once, firm. "Then let it be so. The girl stays." Pike's fury broke into a curse, but the crowd swallowed him whole, their eyes no longer on him, but on the cowboy who had chosen to stand, and the child who had dared to ask. The train's great wheels groaned and shrieked as it lurched back into motion, steam rolling like ghosts across the platform, and with every turn of the iron it carried away the fate that had once threatened to swallow Clara whole. The crowd stood hushed now, their eyes fixed on Jonas and the little girl in his arms, the rag doll pressed between them as though stitched to both their hearts. Pike had been pulled aside, his fury drowned by the voices of his own neighbors, and even Sheriff Callum, who had come to enforce the law, now stood like a sentinel granting his silent blessing. Clara's small hands clung to Jonas's shirt, her face buried against his chest. But when the final whistle faded, she lifted her head, her tear-streaked cheeks shining in the morning light. Her voice, barely a whisper, carried clear enough for every soul to hear. "If I had money, would you stay?" Jonas knelt slowly, setting her feet upon the boards, and with both hands he cupped her shoulders, his eyes glistening with the weight of a promise long overdue. "You don't need money to keep me," he said, his voice breaking but strong, "because I've been waiting my whole life to be asked to stay." A sob rippled through the crowd, women pressing hands to mouths, men bowing their heads, and Clara's lips quivered into the first fragile smile she'd shown all morning. Jonas rose and lifted her onto his horse, placing the rag doll firmly in her lap, and as he swung into the saddle behind her, the town saw not a drifter bound for nowhere but a man anchored at last by the smallest hands and the bravest heart. The crowd parted as he guided the horse forward, silence thick with reverence, and as the sun climbed over the station roof, Clara leaned back against him, clutching the doll, whispering, "Then we're home now." And though the road ahead was uncertain, Jonas knew the answer he had given bound him tighter than any rope, and in that moment, before God and the watching town, he was no longer a wanderer but a father who had stayed. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Echoes of the West. If you had stood at that station when Clara begged with her rag doll, would you have stepped forward too?